Let's prepare you for your test, your first assessment that's coming up. And what I'd like you to do is, again, I've created this slide presentation for you to kind of walk you through what would be beneficial in preparation. So the first slide here, when you click on it, there's some information, and I just go through the terms independent and interdependent and relate them to the second slide about a wheel. And you can see that each of those spokes represent a component of health. And how it relates to what we're doing with the components of health is to be able to recognize how one component can be directly affected by something in a negative way, but oftentimes all of the other components are also indirectly affected by that same result. And so what I ask you to consider is on this slide, it talks about, all right, if there was a triggering incident where a young person breaks their leg snowboarding over winter break, obviously we would all agree that that accident mostly affects their physical health. But as you can see, I continue to go on, and depending on the circumstances in that young person's life, that physical injury can also start to affect the other components of health. And I lay those out in these bullet points that you can read. And I'm going to ask you to do that same thing, to be able to recognize how a single event can affect one component, but they also are indirectly affecting all of the others. And so in this slide, what I talk about is for your test, you'll have to show that you understand how each component of health can be affected by a single event or circumstance. And I give you an example here. And I use an example specifically from the movie because I'm going to ask you to do the exact same thing. And so as you read this slide, it talks about when John Nash was first at Princeton, he was really trying to look for a sense of belonging to give him purpose. He talks about that. He talks about his governing dynamics and the only thing that'll really, really make him matter. And he had the discussion with Charles on the roof about that. And then after his governing dynamics, I want you to think specifically about when he decides to go back to Princeton. And this is after he has had his treatment and then his relapse. And as you can read here, it says, John decides to hang out at Princeton again to have a sense of belonging, to give him purpose. He says, Alicia and I think it would be good for me to be around other people. And so he tries that. But in that circumstance, when he's back at Princeton, as he gets a little bit older, he walks funny, and you can tell that his physical mannerisms were affected by his schizophrenia as well as his mental state. And one of the scenes where the people were making fun of him, and he turned around and then they acted normal, but it's a social and mental emotional aspect when people are making fun of you because you don't necessarily conform to what they think. And then we know that also when he's under stress, he interacts with people who are not real, those delusions, and those delusions have an effect on multiple components of health. And then finally, he chooses to work out in the library and alone to limit social interaction, but he continues to challenge himself to solve problems, kind of a mental, emotional thing. And so again, I'm going to ask you to consider how can you pick a specific event in or from the movie and do the same thing I just did to show the interdependence and independence of the components of health. When you look at these two questions, these are meant for you to practice in advance, and I give you ways that you can do that. And these questions are very similar, and if you choose to work through them, you'll be able to do really well in the test, all right? And so they're just some application things. And the last slide here is, again, really just a practice test. Are you able to answer these three questions completely and succinctly? And if you are, you're going to be really well positioned to do well on your test on Monday. You can see that I've added my email here. If you have questions about things, please email me and I'll respond to you as quickly as I can. And I would ask you again to be respectful of the process and work as diligently as you possibly can to get the grade that you so desire.